The meme about South Africa and land expropriation has been seized by the worst people on the planet, white nationalists across the globe, those who not only want to make up lies, conspiracy theories, and feed racial paranoia and conspiracy theories today, but they also want to undermine the moral and political legacy of one of the greatest accomplishments of the latter part of the 20th century, the destruction of the apartheid system and the heroic, distinct leadership of the African National Congress, which is, of course, not perfect, has had many problems in power. Most of those problems in power having to do with not confronting capitalism and oligarchy nearly enough. But they did liberate South Africa from one of the most morally obscene systems known to humankind. These people not only are making up lies about the system, but the backdoor subtext of all of these conspiracy theories and lies is an indirect, and in some cases quite direct, justification of apartheid in South Africa and a promotion of apartheid South African politics globally. Dylan Roof in 2014 massacred, murdered, committed an act of terrorism in a black church. He was a disturbed, disgusting young man in South Carolina whose resentment, personal failures, and emotional damage transferred itself into a fascination with white nationalism and a hatred of people of color, and also a fascination with Rhodesia, which is what is now Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe's followed a very different trajectory than South Africa. Robert Mugabe is a completely different leader than the South African leaders that liberated South Africa. Not just Nelson Mandela, but also Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, Thabo Mbeki, and many other great fighters and strategists. That being said, regardless of Mugabe's many failures and obscenities and the ongoing problems of Zimbabwe, the liberation and the end of right rule in Rhodesia in 1979 is correctly recognized as the right thing. That is not in question. And if somebody is putting that in question, right. And that, is what connects a disgusting, disturbed young loser in 2014 to Fox, one of Fox's main broadcast talents, and our silly, putty-headed, racist trust fund baby president. We're going to get into this more, but first, here is a clip from Tucker Carlson on Fox News, feeding up and amping up the lies, distortion, conspiracy theories, and latent white nationalism about land expropriation in South Africa.
In an Orwellian turn, various news outlets suggested it was somehow racist to oppose the racist policies of the South African government, even Nazi-like. Watch.
He goes to race. And what better way than to give this neo-Nazi propaganda that white farmers are being killed in South Africa, when in fact that is not true, not based on them being white.
So show that clip to anyone who knows South Africa, who lives there, and see how they respond. They'll laugh bitterly. It's ludicrous. It's a lie. The president of the country, Cyril Ramaphosa, has pledged to change South Africa's constitution in order to legalize the seizure of property without compensation. That's currently being debated in the parliament in South Africa. Even now, the government is trying to confiscate 2 game farms after the owners refused to sell at a fraction of the market price. Everyone in the country understands what these are. They're racial attacks. Okay, say defenders of the South African government in this country, but previous generations in South Africa, under the apartheid government, also seized land on racial grounds. And by the way, that is absolutely true. They did do that. And it's one of the reasons that so many decent people in this country and around the world opposed apartheid. Apartheid was awful and wrong. Things have changed, though. Now our elites endorse the idea of a racial spoils system. And that's the scariest part. It's far more ominous than whatever the corrupt and incompetent government of South Africa is doing. Our ruling class now believes in collective punishment. That is the opposite of justice. Nobody is alleging that individual farm owners in South Africa stole their land. Instead, the claim is that people who resemble them did, and that's enough. Our elites see no problem with that standard. That should worry you a lot. If you got mugged, how would you feel about imprisoning someone who just happened to look like the mugger? How about the mugger's children? Should they be punished too? If those sound like insane questions, that's because they are insane questions. In the West, we punish only the guilty. We do not punish their descendants or everyone with the same hair and eye color. For more than 200 years, pretty much everybody in America agreed on those terms. Now, the people who run our country aren't so sure. Increasingly, they think that generational guilt seems like a fine standard.
So if that seems to you like a masterclass in right-wing sophistry, insane comparisons, and historical literacy, you're correct. Also, those who are running the country are racist idiots who tweet about South African land seizures based off of your segment, Tucker. This is wrong in not only its particulars, but even in its kind of framing orientation. There's obviously zero comparison between apprehending a mugger and addressing the historical and ongoing reality of a policy of land thefts that went on through the 80s in the apartheid government, where people's material resources and ability to make a livelihood were systemically discriminated against and stolen. And what the South African government is proposing, and what even the initial Rainbow Constitution provides for, is the sensible, small scale, and in this case, extremely moderate redressing of land theft that has gone on and went on in apartheid South Africa for decades. First, a couple of reality checks here. Of course, actually, according to the best research and statistics we have available, attacks on white farms in South Africa are at a 20-year low. The expropriation process has not started because the bill has not passed. The new constitutional amendment has not even passed the South African parliament yet. It's in conversation. In 1998, Nelson Mandela said the following, and I'm going to quote now from The Independent. South Africa's President Nelson Mandela warned yesterday that only a fair redistribution of land and its former black owners would guarantee peace as the country emerged from apartheid minority rule. While speaking at an emotional ceremony in the sleepy town of the volatile KwaZulu-Natal province held to mark the handing back of more than 600,000 hectares of land to former black farmers. Mr. Mandela, who became president in 1994 in the country's first democratic election, said that land reform that his government had enacted in the first year would help right the wrongs of the past. Our land reforms programs help address the injustice of apartheid. It fosters national reconciliation and stability. It also underpins economic growth and improves household welfare and food security. These are all undeniable truths. And the policy under Mandela was essentially that land would be sold back with government support to farmers that had been stolen from. And again, this is not historical ancient injustice. This is literally people that were alive still today who were kicked off of farms.
The immediately preceding generation.
It was, like now. Their land was stolen now. And yes, to do a stupid pedestrian analogy, if you stole some money from somebody 15 years ago, and that person and you were still alive, yes, you would have to pay restitution. By the way, and that's correct, there was a big project in terms of war crimes accountability for the stolen art, stolen money, stolen resources of Jews that were slaughtered in the Holocaust. There is a lot of historical basis for getting people their things back that were stolen by governments that oppressed and murdered them, such as in South Africa. Cyril Ramaphosa, South Africa's centrist, Davos-friendly, former Mine Executive Board member president, wrote in the Financial Times on the 19th of August that land redistribution is essential for South African democracy. He said, quote, "It's been nearly 25 years since South Africa became a democracy, yet the promise of the historical achievements have not been fully realized by millions of people who are unemployed and live in poverty." He goes on to say, talk about how, quote from the World Bank, "As the World Bank observes, South Africa's historical, highly skewed distribution of land and productive assets is a source of inequality and social fragility. It also argues that after skills, current distribution of land is the second biggest constraint to poverty reduction and shared prosperity. In order for South Africa to secure the future and to ensure an equitable and just humane development opportunities as envisioned by our first democratic president, Nelson Mandela, reforms of patterns of land ownership in South Africa is a critical issue." This is why the government has embarked on a process of accelerated land reform and why the South Africans are currently engaged in an intense debate over the prospect of expropriation of land without compensation as one of several measures to achieve this reform. Unfortunately, several commentators have confined their engagement on the matter to sound bites and not substance. And I'm going to continue quoting on this because actually the president has outlined this well, President Ramaphosa. The land question goes back to more than a century, to the 1913 Native Lands Act, which provided legislative form to process of dispossession that has been underway since colonial times. It confined the country's African population to slightly more than 10% of the land, reserved the rest for white minority. These laws alienated the majority of our citizens from their livelihoods and their places of birth and burial, stripped them of their assets, and deprived them of their livelihoods. Even now, the dispossession of land continues to determine the prospect of millions of South Africans, and it holds back the country's economic development by restricting ownership to a land of small minority. The apartheid regime ensured that one of the country's most valuable economic resources would be severely underutilized. During this time, the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform released the rights of a land audit to establish land ownership patterns. Among other insights, the forthcoming land audit emerged that individual companies and trusts own 90% of land in South Africa and the state 10%. Of this 90%, individuals own 34%, trusts own 31%, companies own 25%, and community-based organizations own 4%, with cooperative ownership at 1%. In terms of farms and agricultural holdings, 97% of total agricultural holdings are owned by 7% of landowners. For decades, the country's assets, its land, its minerals, its human resources, its enterprises have been owned and controlled in a way that has prevented the extraction of their full value. And this is, of course, fully within neoliberal market logic, but one that says we're going to need to empower a little bit of opportunity for meritocracy. There's nothing remotely radical about this. He goes on to assure that this plan will not erode property rights and that it will focus on areas of underused resources and areas where people have clear title holdings, and in other areas that are like not used land or abandoned buildings. Basically, this policy is social democratic moderation and is essential for the survival of South Africa. And the only people that would have any interest in opposing it are oligarchs globally who recognize somewhere in their senses that we're going to need to do this type of approach internationally. Jeremy Corbyn said a year ago during a housing crisis, why not just use second homes of the rich to house people? And he was absolutely right. And we're going to need to do more of that internationally. It's a boogeyman of white nationalists and racists who stoke racial paranoia among white identity politics and people with zero historical awareness. And also, number three, it is going to be used politically by someone like Julius Malema, who runs the Economic Freedom Fighters, which is South Africa's third party, who was formerly of the ANC. And Malema, unfortunately, while he has some absolutely correct left critiques of capital and racial control of South Africa, is a populist in a negative sense, and doesn't appear to have the type of kind of a long-term Marxist strategy that someone like Ronnie Kasrils says that South Africa needs to achieve its economic, its second liberation, not just its political one. And you're going to see Tucker and all these other guys run around pulling quotes from Julius Malema talking about white people and not deal with Cyril Ramaphosa outlining a centrist case based on World Bank studies and the most basic historical awareness in the Financial Times. Anybody who's talking about land expropriation in South Africa is anything other but a necessary and positive step for broader democracy and equality is an illiterate or a racist or most likely both.
It's funny, you know, when you use metaphors in communicating political ideas, it's usually because it puts you on more solid ground than you would. So I just want to replay this part from Tucker here.
Yep.
If you got mugged, how would you feel about imprisoning someone who just happened to look like the mugger? How about the mugger's children? Should they be punished too?
My question would be, did the mugger's children inherit my watch?
Right. There you go. I would actually say yes. Right? If the mugger's children's entire wealth was built off of a crime that happened to you, all within everybody's lifespans, there is going to be some redistribution. And by the way, if somebody hits me back with, well, what about Native Americans? Yes, Native Americans absolutely should get massive redistribution and restitution from the U.S. government.
And the problem
100%.
The problem here doesn't strike me so much as property rights, but when those rights are coupled with huge inheritance schemes, like the ones we all have basically in the United States, cut the estate tax, like that literally makes historical injustice more important when you allow those gains to carry over.
Precisely. If you want historical injustice to matter less, then tax inheritance. Every fortune was built on a great crime,
and,
David.
You know, and when this happened in South Africa, when this kind of land grab by the whites and European settler colonialists happened, we're talking about the black population only receiving around 7% of the land in South Africa, despite making up 67% of the land. That's right. And there's all these really cynical academic arguments that were trotted forward by white nationalists and folks about what they would call the empty land theory, which was a fairly fallacious anthropological argument about South Africa, saying that the land wasn't used by the native South Africans, etc. Which, to bring up the Native American example, is fairly analogous in what people would argue when they said that it was okay for the white settlers to come in and take the land from the Native Americans. And we also hear frequently a fairly similar argument from Zionists when they say that the Palestinians don't have a historical claim. So there's a lot of continuity when it comes to land grabs by colonial powers, and we should keep that in mind when we're talking about the ways that we want to fix that issue, because the situation in South Africa is still unconscionable. I mean, the amount of land that is owned by these folks who came in and violently took over the land it still lives today. And without doing anything about it, you can't have this kind of economic equality or justice even.
And it's not Zimbabwe. Look, just in terms of now, again, it's a broad proposition. Should Zimbabwe have had land redistribution and expropriation? Yes, of course. What happened in Zimbabwe was a violent process that made no distinctions in terms of productivity and ownership, which South Africa does, right? Like, there were actually literally some small-scale farms that happened to be owned by white people that were a productive part of the agricultural sector and would not be top of the list of focus for getting like land back into use, right? And also, it was given away to political cronies. It wasn't part of an actual cohesive process. And as soon as somebody says, the Zimbabwe example, again, they're just showing their racism. If you can't recognize the fundamental difference between the governance strategies of South Africa and Zimbabwe and the paths they've chosen, you're a racist, historical illiterate, period. The question is how the policy is implemented. How is it done? Not the correctness of it. There absolutely needs to be land expropriation without compensation in South Africa. And no plan on the table is violent. Nothing would leave a small-scale farmer off his land or destitute. Nothing. It's not on the table.
That's the sick sob story that these kind of white nationalists try to bring up. It's just some hardworking small farmers.
It's a lie.
Being attacked by the mob. It is a lie, and it's a very cynical one, because at the end of the day, what we're talking about is the distribution of power.
That's right.
In a major nation, and one that's been continued to be maintained even after the destruction of the apartheid regime.
That was the agreement. They said, we will keep, and it was not just the apartheid remnants were part of it. It's the Davos world. When the South Africans achieved liberation, they achieved a political liberation, and the global financial system essentially said, in some cases literally in meetings in places like New York and Davos, these are the rules of the road. And all of your plans, which by that point of liberation were already moderate social democratic Keynesianism, which still would have meant land redistribution, massive redistribution of resources, because it was a racist capital oligarchy. That's what you do when you achieve liberation. You redistribute the resources, period. Period. And this is not, I mean, I'm sorry, it just enrages me because I knew that this was going to be a talking point based on racism and historical literacy, and I knew it was going to wind up in the fat fuck president's Twitter feed.
And as a consequence of that, as well as the narrative that people have been receiving in the main in like American media, people who might not be very familiar with South Africa, and you know, the lots of things that are going on there, are now getting this very bizarre narrative, which is trying to legitimize this white nationalist critique of what's happening in South Africa. You've seen that even in CNN or even Washington Post. I mean, the way that people are talking about it now is as if, you know, the Tucker Carlson position is somewhat legitimate, right? But maybe, you know, overzealous on Tucker's. No, it's absolutely illegitimate. It's absolutely racist, and it's absolutely a white nationalist position.
It is a white nationalist racist position, and the closest analog in mainstream discourse for people in the 1980s who were doing bullshit arguments that you didn't need sanctions, that you didn't need to back the ANC, that there could be some type of market-driven democratization. And Chris Kobach studied under Samuel Huntington at Harvard, who explicitly argued against giving everybody the right to vote in South Africa. And the Reagan administration vetoed a sanctions package against South Africa. These people are racist. They're white nationalist capitalists, and they are political enemies of anybody who has faith in humanity and opposes bigotry. And what Cyril Ramaphosa is proposing is so moderate and so commonsensical that if it does not happen, it will empower toxic forces across supposedly the ideological spectrum, but really actually just different variants of right-wing populism showing up in different guises. It's disgusting. And it's disgusting that people don't know that history, and it's disgusting that within such a short period of time, something that was an unequivocal moral gain that everybody, including people that I'm sure didn't believe in it, had to at least pay lip service to, they're flipping on. It's fucking disgusting. And I would support any expropriation without compensation of any of Tucker Carlson's resources. Little Swanson.
We're coming for that.
Yeah, we're coming. Yeah.
Frozen food fortune.
Yeah, little frozen food heiress. Fuck you.
Those crimes against culinary taste. Will not be perpetuated onto future generations.
Absolutely
buddy.
not. Absolutely
Gotta nip that in the bud.
Absolutely not.